Hello, welcome back to the History Sphere. What you're about to hear is part 35 in my ongoing series on the decline and fall of the Soviet Union. As I say at the start of every episode, I write these episodes so that they will stand on their own to the extent possible, meaning you can listen and get something out of it without going back and listening to all the previous episodes first. But I also write them as part of a series that is meant to come together as a larger whole. So if you are a fan of context and details like I am, those earlier episodes are available to go back and listen to in the same place you found this one. Last time, on the History Sphere, I covered the reforms of perestroika and glasnost in the Soviet Union in the aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster. Today, I will begin what is likely to be at least 3 episodes on the revolutions that erupted across the Soviet satellite states of the Eastern Bloc in 1989. This is The End of History, Part 35. There are a lot of ways in which I've been relatively fortunate in life due to the time, place, and circumstances of my birth. One that I think is terribly important is the fact that, having been born and raised in the United States, my native language is English. Since the end of World War II, the power and influence wielded by the United States on the global stage made English an incredibly useful and popular language for people all over the world to learn. In some countries and in some professions, a working knowledge of English is not just a bonus, but absolutely essential. Speaking English as my native language has opened up a lot of opportunities for me, for instance, to do work at the United Nations, where English is the primary working language. It has also allowed me to travel the world pretty extensively, and I never really had to learn the language of the various places where I've traveled, because no matter how remote the location, there's almost always somebody nearby who can speak English. Don't get me wrong, I always make an effort to at least learn a few words and phrases of the language of any country I travel to, but I don't really have to speak the language. This was actually rather frustrating to me during the summer I spent in Austria, where I actually put forward a genuine effort to learn German, but most people I talked to, rather than struggle through my bad German, simply preferred to speak English, which they could speak fluently and easily. It made it harder for me to learn German, and I never really did get a good grasp on the language. I know, poor me, right? The one language over the years, other than English, that I have managed to get a firm grasp of and that I can still speak and understand reasonably well is Russian. I put a great deal of effort into learning Russian, including 2 long-term stays in Russia, where I immersed myself in the language and only spoke English when I called home. After learning Russian, one of the things that has struck me about it, in contrast to my native English, is how similar it is to other related languages. English is technically a Germanic language, but it's never really mutually intelligible with German or any of the Scandinavian languages that it's supposedly related to. It's quite different. Russian, on the other hand, is incredibly similar to other Slavic languages, especially the other East Slavic languages, Ukrainian and Belarusian. But even the more distant Slavic languages like Serbian and Bulgarian have a lot of similarities, and often when I overhear people speaking these languages, I can understand a lot of what they're saying, even if I don't have sufficient knowledge of the language's construction to speak back to them. There is one Slavic language, however, that is something of an exception, at least for me: Polish. Someone who is an expert in Slavic languages may be able to shed more light on this than I can, but Polish just sounds different to me, and I have always had a hard time understanding and pronouncing Polish words. All this is to say, I'm going to be talking a lot about Poland today, and I'm going to struggle with the pronunciation of some of the names and words, much more so than I do with pronouncing Russian names and words. I'm sure that my Russian pronunciation throughout this podcast has been less than perfect, as it is my second language, but I make no apology for it, as I at least know the language and have a decent idea of how to say most of the names, even if I make a mistake here or there. But I don't have the same knowledge of Polish. I don't have a lot of listeners in Poland yet, But I do hope that when, in the future, the history sphere becomes the next great sensation in Poland, my droves of Polish fans will understand that I am doing my best, and I hope I'm saying everything correctly. It seems fitting, almost poetic, that Poland, which was at the very center of the clashes that led to the start of the Cold War, once again took center stage in the collapse of communism and the end of the Cold War. Those of you who listened to my episodes on the end of World War II and the early Cold War, or who are otherwise familiar with the history of modern Europe, likely recall that the question of the future of Poland was one of the primary points of contention between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies that ultimately broke the relationship and led to the Cold War. The British, in particular, had never lost sight of the fact that they went to war with Nazi Germany in defense of Poland, and they were not enthusiastic about delivering Poland from German occupation only to exchange it for a Soviet occupation. Poland had had nothing to do with the United States' war aims, and the Americans were a lot less concerned with the freedom of the Poles, but they were apprehensive about communism, and were not happy about seeing it spread to the heart of Europe. They also didn't trust Stalin or the Soviets. The perspective of Stalin and the Soviets on Poland was quite a bit different. It was far more strategic than ideological. For one, Poland had been ruled by the Russian Tsars prior to the revolution in 1917, and Stalin believed it to be rightfully within his sphere of influence. More importantly, though, Stalin saw Poland as a strategic vulnerability. Twice in his lifetime, Russia and then the Soviet Union had been invaded from the West through Poland. He saw it as vital to control Poland and maintain it as a friendly buffer between his own country and any potentially unfriendly power who might again attempt to invade his country from the West. And the best way to ensure Poland remained friendly to him was to make sure that its leaders shared his ideology and could be controlled by him. Ultimately, despite protestations from the British and Americans, it was the reality of the military situation on the ground that determined the post-war political reality for Poland. The Red Army had swept into Poland in 1944 and 1945, pushing the Germans out only after conveniently allowing the Germans to crush a Polish nationalist uprising in Warsaw. The Soviets had shed blood to conquer Poland, and they weren't about to be easily dislodged without a fight. And the West, having just concluded the deadliest conflict in human history, was not eager to have that fight. And so Poland was abandoned to its fate. Vague, half-hearted promises by Stalin to hold democratic elections in Poland never materialized, and the nation gradually descended into the role of an authoritarian, communist satellite of the Soviet Union. Poland, at first glance, shared a lot of similarities with the other Eastern and Central European states that were drawn into the so-called Eastern Bloc. Like the other Eastern Bloc states, Poland was not a fully sovereign state. Hungarian-American historian Victor Sebastian describes the relationship as one of colonialism, but with the traditional economic roles of the colonizer and colonized being somewhat reversed. At least early on, in the late 1940s and 1950s, the states of Eastern and Central Europe, particularly Poland, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany, actually had an industrial sector that was significantly more developed than that of the Soviet Union. So the Eastern Bloc states produced refined manufactured goods for the Soviet Union and were in return provided with raw materials from the Soviet Union to fuel that industry. Politically, these countries were independent of the Soviet Union, but not entirely sovereign. Moscow generally allowed a great deal of autonomy in the internal affairs of their satellite states, as long as those states remained communist and loyal to the Soviet Union. The political environment in these Eastern Bloc countries ranged from the outright Stalinist rule of Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania to the relatively more liberal rule of János Kadar in Hungary, with most of the rest falling somewhere in between these two on the authoritarian spectrum. Hungary was by no means a democracy during this period, don't get me wrong. It was just a little more relaxed in its authoritarianism than some of the other Eastern Bloc states, largely springing from János Kadar's experience during and after the 1956 anti-communist uprising in Hungary, which, for those of you who are new to the podcast, I discussed at length all the way back in episode 15. Khadr chose to rule with a gentler hand than his counterparts in order to prevent future unrest of that nature. As we saw in episode 15, where I discussed the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, and in episode 22, where I discussed the 1968 Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia, the Soviets only allowed their satellite states so much latitude in international affairs. The minute that the rulers in Moscow, be it Khrushchev or Brezhnev, even suspected that one of their allies might be drifting away from communism or the Warsaw Pact military alliance, the Soviet Union was more than willing to brutally crush dissent within those states. This policy came to be known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. In essence, the doctrine holds that the Soviet Union held a special status as a vanguard among socialist states, and that whenever any socialist state begins to revert to capitalism or reject socialism, it is the right and duty of the Soviet Union to step in and enforce their version of socialism within these countries. Though in its relationship to Moscow, Poland had a lot in common with other Eastern Bloc states, there were also a few key characteristics that set it apart. For one, Poland was more homogeneous than some of the other states of Eastern Europe, particularly due to the ethnic cleansing that took place there during World War II. It meant there was more of a spirit of national unity than, for instance, could be found in Czechoslovakia or Romania. Second, the people of Poland were also more religious, not just than other Eastern Bloc states, but indeed most countries overall. In 1980, even amidst the communist persecution of religion, Poland had the highest rate of regular church attendance in Europe, with over half the population regularly attending Catholic Mass. The Catholic faith was simply too strongly rooted in Poland for the hardline communists to be able to stamp it out. Participation in the church was officially tolerated, and many members of the Communist Party were even sympathetic to it. There was an understanding between the Polish Catholic clergy and the regime that as long as the church did not venture into open criticism of communism or the regime, they would be left alone. The religious unity of Poland was decisively strengthened in October 1978, when Karol Wojtyła, the Archbishop of Kraków in Poland, was elected as the first non-Italian pope since the 16th century. He assumed the papal title of John Paul II upon his ascension to the papacy, and I will from now on use that name because it's so much easier for me to say. Stalin had once allegedly derided the power of the papacy by asking an American diplomat, facetiously, how many divisions the Pope had at his command. This quote is likely apocryphal, as there just isn't enough primary source evidence as far as I'm concerned to prove he really said it, but it definitely is something he might have said. Stalin did not understand soft power. He understood power only through force, through divisions and weapons and terror. And yet the papacy would ultimately play a subtle but important role in the collapse of communism in Europe. From the earliest days of his papacy, John Paul II was openly critical of communism. He also immediately began removing clergymen who were deemed too close to communist leaders in the Eastern Bloc from their positions. Despite protestations from the KGB, the Polish government allowed John Paul II to visit Poland in June 1979. Wherever he went in his home country, the new Polish Pope was greeted by massive, adoring crowds, far larger and more enthusiastic than those that turned out for official state gatherings. In Warsaw alone, a crowd of 3 million people came out to hear him speak. He had previously agreed with Poland's communist leaders that his visit would entail no incitement to rebellion or criticism of communism or the regime, but John Paul II snuck in criticism in between the lines where he could, emphasizing the importance of freedom of religion as the most fundamental human right, and saying prayers for Polish workers who had been killed by the authorities in recent upheavals while striking for better working conditions, including holding a special mass at the Lenin Shipyard in Gdansk, the site where, in 1970, workers went on strike to demand legalization of independent trade unions free from the control of the governing Communist Party. When Władysław Gomułka, the Polish Communist Party leader, ordered the strike suppressed, the authorities killed 75 people in the ensuing mayhem. When John Paul II chose to hold Mass in this place and to pray for the souls of the 75 people who died there, even though there was no explicit mention of communism or the regime, the Polish people and the entire world knew what the gesture meant. It was a call to peaceful resistance. It was at that same Lenin Shipyard in Gdansk, just 1 year after the Pope's visit, that the first seeds of revolution in Poland sprouted. The stagnation era of the 1960s and 70s hit the Eastern Bloc even harder than it hit the Soviet Union. Unlike the USSR, the Eastern Bloc states did not have massive oil reserves that they could export to offset economic downturn and prevent shortages of essential goods. The only way the communist government of Poland was able to stave off economic disaster throughout the 1970s was by doing what the economic planners in Moscow stubbornly refused to do: raising prices on essential goods, including food and fuel. Of course, the wages of workers were not keeping up with the runaway inflation and its corresponding price increases, leading to widespread dissatisfaction among workers. Communist theory had always held that the socialist state was a state by and for the workers, and yet the official Communist Party trade unions were subservient to the party leadership, and therefore did nothing to advocate for the workers they supposedly represented. And so throughout the 1970s, periodic workers' strikes began to spring up all over Poland. The workers were demanding not just better working conditions, but the right to organize and collectively bargain in unions that were independent of the Communist Party, and would therefore actually represent the interests of their members. Gomulka's government essentially adopted a divide-and-conquer approach to dealing with these strikes. The regime would negotiate with strikers and make concessions in one part of the country, while simultaneously using violence to suppress a strike in another region. The idea was to keep different groups of workers thinking they did not share the same interests, and prevent them from coalescing into a larger nationwide movement. But the one demand the government never gave into, no matter what, was to allow workers to organize in official unions outside the approved Communist Party-controlled unions. To do so would be to admit that the Communist Party did not truly represent the workers as they claimed to do. And if the Communist Party did not represent the workers, what need was there for the party to exist at all? The very legitimacy of the regime hung in the balance. Despite the regime's refusal to legitimize independent trade unions, they could not stop such unions from forming organically among the workers. The party did sort of half-heartedly try to bust these unions, but there was an understanding that they could not break them altogether without destabilizing the country. So the main concern of the authorities was, once again, to prevent these disparate unions from finding common cause and coalescing into a nationwide opposition to the communist regime. But ultimately, they could not stop that from happening either. By the late 1970s, these various underground unions began to associate with other underground unions in coalitions, recognizing they shared similar interests, forming regional organizations, including one called the Free Trade Unions of the Coast, which included the underground union of the workers at the Lenin Shipyard in Gdansk. Then, in 1977, a nationwide organization emerged that, though it didn't bring these various underground unions under any kind of centralized leadership, at least gave them a common contact. This was the Committee for Social Self-Defense, known by its Polish acronym KOR. The KOR was not a union, but a human rights organization, similar to the Helsinki monitoring groups that emerged in the Soviet Union around the same time. I talked a bit about those back in episode 23, when I addressed dissident movements in the USSR. Like the Helsinki monitoring groups, the KOR took the Polish Communist Constitution at face value, accepting the fictitious civil and political rights guaranteed to them by law as true, and pushing the state to live up to its expressed values. As they were explicitly expressing loyalty to communism and socialist values, it put the government in an awkward position. Though they did their best to isolate and arrest individual members, Polish security forces were unable to justify outlawing the organization entirely. Among the members of KOR were many Polish lawyers, and one of the features that they became most well known for was providing free legal defense to workers who were arrested for striking, and through this, they built a relationship with most of the underground unions across the country. So by the end of the 1970s, all the pieces were in place for these strikes to become a revolutionary movement. All that was needed was a spark. And that spark was ignited in the summer of 1980, back at the Lenin Shipyard in Gdansk. On August 9, 1980, Anna Valentinovich, a 51-year-old crane operator at the Lenin Shipyard, was fired, just 5 months ahead of her retirement, for her participation in the free trade unions of the coast. Anna had once been a convinced communist. There are differing accounts on whether she was actually a party member, with some sources claiming she was, and others claiming that she was merely a member of a communist youth league and never formally joined the party. Either way, as a young woman, she seems to have been a true believer in the Marxist-Leninist ideology. In 1950, her first year working at the Lenin Shipyard as a welder, at the age of 21, she'd even been awarded the coveted Hero of Labor Award. It's not clear when her disillusionment with communism began, but it was certainly accelerated by the deaths of the strikers at the Lenin Shipyard in December 1970. Anna had not been among them, as she was not at all politically active at that point, but she had known many of them. She became known for organizing an annual memorial to those fallen strikers and for regularly lighting candles at their graves. In 1978, Anna became one of the founding members of the free trade unions of the coast, and subsequently one of their most enthusiastic organizers. She was well known by her fellow workers as well as the party bosses who managed the shipyard to be a prime distributor of the union's newsletter. Anna was also incredibly popular among the workers at the Lenin Shipyard. She was known as someone to whom people could come with their problems. She was often sought out by her fellow workers to resolve disputes, give advice, or just listen to someone who needed a friendly ear. On August 9, 1980, she was summoned by the shipyard's personnel office and fired. She was allegedly fired for thievery, the accusation being that she was seen taking candle stubs from graves with the intent of reusing them to light candles at the graves of the martyrs of the 1970 strike. By charging her with thievery instead of a purely political crime, the party bosses ensured that she would lose her pension and retirement benefits. The union immediately began printing leaflets and distributing them to the workers in the shipyard, calling for a strike to restore Anna to her position and secure her pension. Union organizers argued that if Anna could be so unceremoniously fired, none of them were safe. On August 14th, as the 6 a.m. shift started, about 100 workers walked off the job. Within half an hour, another 500 had joined them. As the marching strikers approached the gate of the shipyard, the director of the shipyard, Clemens Gdansk, climbed a crane to address the crowd. Gdansk, by all accounts, had a reputation as a fair man, and he was even well liked by most of the workers. He gave a speech promising to hear out the strikers' demands if they returned to their jobs. Some in the crowd appeared to be wavering, when another man climbed the crane next to Gdansk and gave a counter speech, urging the strikers on. That man was Lech Walesa, an electrician who had been fired from his position at the shipyard 4 years earlier for his union organizing activity. Those of you who have read ahead will know that in about a decade, Walesa would become the first democratically elected president of post-communist Poland. In his speech to the striking workers, Walesa reminded them of his own firing and spoke passionately about Anna and her pension. He called for a sit-in occupation strike rather than marching out of the gate, which many of the workers remembered was the point at which they were met with brutal force in previous strikes. The speech was met with cheers, and the strike continued. The striking workers quickly elected a strike leadership committee with Walesa at its head. Left with no choice, Gdansk agreed to negotiate with the strike committee, and as a sign of good faith, he even sent his own car to pick up Anna Valentinovich and bring her back to the factory so that she could take part in the negotiations as well. Though like previous strikes, this strike at the Lenin Shipyard was not reported in the official state media. The previous affiliation and cooperation of unions around the country through KOR allowed the word to spread, and in the ensuing 2 days, strikes sprang up all over the country, demanding not just Valentinovich's reinstatement, but the legitimization of an independent union. The spread of the strike brought Polish industry to a screeching halt, something the government, already in a deep economic crisis, could ill afford. And so the government attempted its divide and conquer tactics once again. They gave permission for Gdansk to agree to some of the demands of the Lenin Shipyard workers, including Valentinovich's reinstatement, as long as they ended the strike. The other strikes that had sprung up around the country could then be variously dealt with by using both the carrot and the stick. When these terms were presented to Lech Walesa on August 16th, he and the other strike leaders at first agreed to the terms. Valentinovich and Walesa would both be restored to their positions at the Lenin Shipyard. The shipyard workers would receive a roughly 7% raise, and the strikers would be granted immunity from prosecution. Gdansk announced over the shipyard's loudspeakers that the strike had ended, and Walesa stood before the crowd of striking workers with his fist raised in the air, and he shouted, quote, "We won," end quote. But rather than cheers, Walesa was met with boos and jeers. Some in the crowd yelled out, calling him a traitor or a sellout. He was a bit taken aback at first by the reaction, but it soon became apparent that the workers did not want to abandon their fellow strikers around the country. They no longer wanted to play the regime's game. They wanted to continue the strike until all the strikes were resolved together. Walesa could see which way the wind was blowing, and he changed his tune, telling the crowd to hold a vote, and vowing that if they voted to continue the strike, he would tell Gdansk there was no deal. The striking workers voted overwhelmingly to continue the strike. Following the vote, Walesa again addressed the crowd, saying, quote, "So we will strike. It will be a solidarity strike. I will be the last one to leave the yard," end quote. He was once again met with cheers, and the word he used, solidarity, would become the name of the new nationwide labor movement. The Polish regime at first refused to negotiate on those terms. They hoped that the Soviet Red Army would swoop in to save them and end the strike. And had this happened a few years earlier, they might have. But the war in Afghanistan had fundamentally changed the shape of Soviet foreign policy. They had rolled into Afghanistan in December 1979, expecting the kind of easy victory they had experienced in Prague in 1968, and Budapest before that. But in August 1980, the realization had kicked in that they were not engaged in a brief intervention in Afghanistan to prop up a friendly regime, but a war against a determined enemy. And the leaders in the Kremlin really didn't see any way out. The last thing any of them wanted was to be caught up in yet another foreign quagmire when they were already so distracted. The Soviets would not intervene to crush solidarity. It just wasn't worth the risk for them. They were certainly annoyed by solidarity exposing the hypocrisy of the socialist system by revealing that the workers were not, in fact, in charge. But at this point, solidarity's demands were relatively moderate. They were not calling for an end to communism or a Polish withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact, the Soviets' two most important strategic concerns. They simply were calling for legalization of an independent trade union, which to the Soviet Union at that moment in history just didn't seem like that big of a deal. And without Soviet support, the Polish communists had no choice but to negotiate. And so on August 31st, 1980, the Polish government signed the Gdansk Agreement, allowing for the first fully legitimate and legal independent trade union in the communist world. Solidarity. Solidarity held its first national congress in September of that year, and Lech Walesa was elected as its president. It seemed as though a corner had been turned, and Poland had taken an important step towards freedom. But the reactionaries in Poland's Communist Party weren't about to give up without a fight. On October 18, 1981, the Polish Communist Party elected a new first secretary, Wojciech Jaruzelski. At first glance, Jaruzelski does not appear to be the type of man destined to lead a hardline communist reactionary movement. Born in 1923 to a relatively wealthy landowning family, Jaruzelski fled Poland with his parents in September 1939 as the Germans and Soviets invaded and swallowed up Poland. The family fled first to Lithuania, only to find themselves again under Soviet occupation the following year. They were identified as potential enemies of the people and deported to Siberia, where Wojciech's father was separated from the rest of the family and sent to the Gulag, after which he, to the best of my knowledge, disappears from the historical record. Wojciech was sent with his mother to live and work in the Altai region of Siberia, and there something rather strange happened. Wojciech seems to have genuinely fallen in love with Russia and Russians. He would later say of his experience in Siberia, quote, "In Siberia, the cold was indescribable. I worked very hard. All this should have made me hate the Russians. Paradoxically, the opposite began to happen. I fell in love with the Russians and their indomitable spirit, with the country itself, with the ordinary people I got to know." End quote. As he fell in love with the Russian people, Jaruzelski also apparently became convinced by their ideology, becoming an ardent and enthusiastic communist. In 1941, Jaruzelski joined the Red Army and was sent for officer training in Kazakhstan. In 1943, he volunteered for reassignment from the regular Red Army to the 1st Polish Army, a unit made up mostly of Polish communists that fought the Germans on the Eastern Front under Soviet command. He participated in the Soviet takeover of Warsaw and installing a pro-Moscow government in Poland, and he also served with distinction in combat during the Battle of Berlin in 1945. After the war, he returned to Poland, became a member of the Polish Communist Party, and continued to serve in the post-war Polish Army, eventually becoming a general. He was elevated to the Central Committee of the Polish Communist Party in 1960, and became the Polish Defense Minister in 1968, overseeing the Polish participation in crushing the Prague Spring that year. Immediately after his election as First Secretary in 1981, Jaruzelski at first tried to sell himself as a moderate, even meeting with Lech Walesa and hinting that he intended to form a coalition government with Solidarity. But all the while he was secretly preparing to destroy them. On December 12, 1981, he was ready to strike. Just before midnight, he declared martial law. The military moved quickly to swoop in and arrest the leaders of Solidarity, including Lech Walesa. The measures legalizing Solidarity were reversed, and the union was suppressed and driven underground, this time without its principal leaders. Walesa and the other Solidarity leaders were not executed or treated particularly harshly. As a victim of it himself, Jaruzelski had no desire to return Poland to the darkest days of Stalinism. He just wanted to reverse the decline and stabilize the power of the communist government. And he believed the best way to do that was to get the leaders of Solidarity out of the way and out of the public eye. Walesa, for instance, was sentenced to a rather comfortable house arrest, where he was even granted conjugal visitation with his wife. About a year later, convinced that his point had been made and the supremacy of the party was re-established, Jaruzelski quietly released Walesa and the other Solidarity leaders. Jaruzelski did not actually destroy Solidarity, however, but merely drove it underground. And in doing so, he confirmed that it was a force to be feared by the communist rulers of Poland. This only served to convince the CIA and other Western intelligence services that funding Solidarity was a worthwhile investment. Throughout the remainder of the 1980s, huge amounts of money flowed into Solidarity's coffers, mostly from the CIA and from the Vatican, with the Polish Pope John Paul II taking the most active role outside the United States in supporting the movement. By suppressing Solidarity, Jaruzelski only ensured that it would transform from a moderate labor movement to a movement for national liberation, and that they would be stronger than ever before. Using technology borrowed from their supporters in the CIA, Solidarity activists throughout the 1980s would hijack the airwaves, taking over radio and television broadcasts to run unauthorized commercials criticizing the government. One of the main strengths of Solidarity at this time was that, as an illegal organization, unable to stand for election or put forward a formal program, they could position themselves purely as an organization in opposition to the government. Whichever direction your objection to communism came from, Solidarity was there to speak for you. It united religious Catholics with old-school conservatives and social democrats. The big tent nature of Solidarity is, in my opinion, the main reason for its ultimate success. Try as they might, the communists could not divide the opposition, which remained united behind Solidarity. Things limped on like that for the next 6 years. Strikes would break out periodically, but Jaruzelski's regime was able to keep them isolated and use the apparatus of state violence to keep solidarity suppressed. Though he had managed to stabilize the political situation and assert the dominance of the Communist Party, Jaruzelski was unable to fix the deteriorating economic situation that continued to affect the Soviet Union and the entire Eastern Bloc. So he followed Gorbachev's lead, instituting a series of perestroika-style reforms in Poland. And in this, he thought he saw an opportunity to get one over on solidarity, too. He decided to hold a nationwide referendum on the reforms, asking the people of Poland to vote on whether or not they supported the program. This, he thought, would force Solidarity to take a position for or against the reforms. If they came out against the reforms, Jaruzelski could paint them as unreasonable obstacles to progress. And if they came out in favor of the reforms, then he could successfully co-opt them as partners of his government. But Solidarity wisely just didn't take the bait, mostly continuing the same kind of criticism against the government that they'd been leveling for years. On top of that, the referendum was a failure. The rules of the vote were that to pass, the measure required 51% not of those who actually voted, but of eligible voters. But the turnout was only 66%. 2/3 of those who turned out voted in favor of the measure, but that wasn't enough to pass it, leaving Jaruzelski looking like a loser. Poland's economic meltdown, meanwhile, was continuing and getting worse. By 1988, inflation was at 50% and rising, and the country was crippled by chronic shortages of essential goods. There was no alternative. The government had to raise prices to stabilize the economy, which they did in April 1988, raising prices by roughly 40%, almost across the board. This massive price increase was met with strikes, the likes of which had not been seen since 1980. The strikes were once again organized by Solidarity, with Lech Walesa at their head. The strikes continued throughout the summer. At this point, there were very real doubts about whether the communist government would be able to hold on. Jaruzelski took the traditional step of appealing to the Soviets for help. At this point, Brezhnev or Andropov may have sent the tanks into Warsaw, but Gorbachev was a very different kind of leader. For both moral and practical reasons, Gorbachev abandoned the Brezhnev doctrine. On July 12, 1988, Gorbachev visited Warsaw amidst the strikes, where he was actually very warmly received by the Polish people, who understood he was a different kind of Soviet leader. Many Poles broadly supported his efforts to end the Cold War and reform socialism, and believed he might pave the way for a Poland truly independent of Soviet domination. In a private meeting with Jaruzelski, during this visit, Gorbachev confirmed that Moscow would not be swooping in to save the regime, and he encouraged Jaruzelski to get on with negotiations for a unity government with Solidarity. On August 26, 1988, Jaruzelski reached out personally to Lech Walesa to propose a roundtable talk between the government and Solidarity to discuss the future of Poland. There were some within Solidarity who urged Walesa to reject the proposal, believing the communists were on their last legs. They saw no benefit in negotiating. But Walesa convinced a majority that it was the best move for the country, that if the regime collapsed completely, that could mean chaos for Poland, and who knows what could emerge from that. By negotiating, he hoped to gain a seat at the table that would facilitate a transition to true democracy, a perspective that would ultimately be vindicated by history. Negotiations began on February 6, 1989, and went on for nearly 2 months. At first, nobody really knew quite what to do. Representatives from Solidarity were rightly skeptical that the communists intended to give up any real power. Meanwhile, on the communist side, there was a mix of opinions. Many thought the talks to be a mistake, while others recognized them as an opportunity for the communists to hold on to power by rigging the game in a new system that would only throw some breadcrumbs to the opposition. But the communists mostly failed to formulate any kind of unified strategy for the talks. As one of the leaders of the communist negotiating team stated at the time, quote, "There are plenty of Marxist-Leninist textbooks about taking power, but none about giving it up," End quote. On April 5th, 1989, the two sides emerged from the talks with an agreement that revolutionized the government of Poland. Firstly, they agreed to create the office of president, a new office that it was assumed would pass to Jaruzelski, but that would be independent of the Communist Party apparatus and nullify any future power held by the first secretary of the Communist Party. Secondly, the agreement created a bicameral legislature consisting of a lower house, or Sejm, and a Senate. Within the Sejm, 65% of the seats would be reserved for communists elected in the traditional Marxist-Leninist way, by running unopposed and subject to a yes or no vote. The other 35% of the seats in the Sejm would be freely contested between the communists and any other political party. The Senate, importantly, would be 100% freely elected in contested races. Parliamentary elections were scheduled for June 4th, 1989. Many criticized Solidarity for accepting this deal. Almost everyone on both sides assumed that the communists would win at least some of the freely contested seats, and that they would continue to dominate the government. Lech Walesa, however, had a better sense of where the winds were blowing, and was more confident that Solidarity would sweep the election. Even if they didn't, he thought the agreement a step in the right direction that would give Solidarity a real voice, so he used all of his influence to persuade the other Solidarity leaders to accept it. Walesa was also apprehensive about a potential Soviet intervention. Gorbachev had more or less abandoned the Brezhnev doctrine by refusing to intervene at an earlier stage, but nobody was sure how he would react to the actual fall of a communist government in the Eastern Bloc. Walesa was wary of pushing the communists too far too fast. The communists came out of the roundtable talks thinking that they had secured their own power for the future. But when the election was held on June 4th, Solidarity won in an almost unimaginable landslide. Solidarity won an overwhelming majority of the contested seats in the Sejm, and 99 out of 100 seats in the freely elected Senate, with the lone remaining seat going not to the communists, but to an independent candidate. This was more than enough for Solidarity to elect one of its members as prime minister. At the urging of Walesa, they chose a relative moderate as prime minister, Tadeusz Mazowiecki. On August 24th, 1989, as your humble 2-month-old podcast host laid in his crib, Mazowiecki was sworn in as the first non-communist head of government in an Eastern Bloc state since the Second World War. There were some among the communists who floated the idea of rejecting the election results and seizing power again, like they had in 1981. But Jaruzelski rejected that notion outright, as did the other communist leaders, even the hardliners, as they doubted their ability to pull it off without Soviet support, which Gorbachev had signaled they would not have. Ultimately, Jaruzelski did secure the presidency, but he needed support from the more moderate wing of Solidarity to do it, which, with Lech Walesa's backing, he got. But as president, he would be only a figurehead. It was to be a Solidarity-led government. Further constitutional reforms followed, with the Sejm eventually becoming freely elected like the Senate. The following year, rather than try to cling to power in a country that had clearly and decisively rejected him, Jaruzelski resigned the presidency, opening the office up to a special election, which the parliament determined would be held by a national popular vote. On December 9, 1990, Lech Walesa won the presidency, with over 75% of the vote, and the last vestiges of communism in Poland were swept away. Though the process had been somewhat gradual, to the rest of the world, by June 1989 it was clear that communism was coming to an end in Poland. But Poland was just the first domino to fall. Poland's revolution would soon spread like wildfire across the Eastern Bloc. The Iron Curtain was falling, and the communist world was unraveling. That's everything for today. Thank you so much for listening. As always, a very special thank you to my patrons who support the show with monthly donations on Patreon. Your support allows me to keep doing this, and I couldn't do it without you. If you're not a patron yet and you want to be, you can sign up to support the show and get access to exclusive history content at patreon.com/HistorySpherePodcast. A link to the Patreon is also available on the show's website at www.thehistorysphere.com. On that website, you will also find links to the show's streaming platforms, social media, and a list of my sources for this episode. That website again is www.thehistorysphere.com. Next time, on The History Sphere, I will continue my narrative of the 1989 revolutions as the fire spreads from Poland to the rest of the Eastern Bloc. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful day.